As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect. Joining me is my co-host, Christian. And today we have somebody, if you are in these Twitter streets, has become known for delivering the news, all things about the Ansarullah, which I am excited to speak about today. Joining us for the first time, and it's a long time in the making, we have Rune Houthis joining us for the first time on the Malcolm Effect. How are you?
I am really good. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute honor and privilege. So I just want to go into it straight away. And my immediate first question is, can you lay a bit of a background to the situation in Yemen with the emergence of the Ansarullah, who are also known, or people refer to them as the Houthis, and I also want to go into a bit later why people see that as a derogatory term. But first, let's speak about a background to the situation in Yemen and the emergence of the Ansarullah.
Yeah, well, so I'm generally a firm believer in that, to understand political currents of any kind, you really have to dig into the history of the country as a whole, because that's really where you get like a holistic picture of why something has emerged and the material conditions that sort of led to the emergence of, in this particular case, the Ansarullah. So Yemen is a very peculiar country in many ways. It's one of those countries that hasn't really been, in many ways, benefiting from the anti-colonial struggle that they waged, in the 1960s. Much like you could probably draw a parallel to the situation with regards to Haiti, and I'm no expert on Haiti, but I do know for a fact that they have been punished by the French and by the Americans and by many imperial powers for, daring to liberate themselves back in the late 1700s. And it's the same thing with Yemen basically. They had a monarchy up until 1962, then a republican revolution in 62 that later turned into a civil war, which ended in 1970, and in the south, because there were two separate countries at the time, separated by imperial powers, of course, and different cultures, but we might get into that at some later point. They had their own anti-colonial struggle against the British a year later in 1963, which ended in 1967 with the total British withdrawal from South Yemen. So around that time, there were two separate countries. The South became eventually the first and only Arab Marxist-Leninist state, and the northern Yemeni nation state was sort of lingering within the realm of Arab nationalism, which was very popular at the time. But a lot of events from the 1960s and onwards start to take shape that would gradually force both nation states into a political and economic decline. So you had numerous attempts by numerous individuals who wanted to, restart the reconstruction and the reform and to progress their country and nation and people. But every time they've done that, they've faced extreme amounts of opposition, not by their own people by any measure, but by outside forces, and in particular by Saudi Arabia. You had in 1973, you had the emergence in North Yemen, the emergence of Colonel Ibrahim al-Hamdi, who rose to power in a bloodless coup, and he was by far the most popular president Yemen has probably ever had. He talked about economic reform, that the peasants should control the agricultural sector. He, unified the agricultural cooperatives into one big union at the time, which was like a very big deal. He abolished the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, which pissed off Saudi Arabia in probably the worst possible way you could imagine, because it's really within the Yemeni tribes. It's a tribal society, and it still very much is. And it was through many of these tribes that Saudi Arabia had their influence, or gained, took their influence into Yemeni politics and economy. So Ibrahim al-Hamdi basically did everything he could to fill in the gaps and close the loopholes that would allow foreign powers to gain that influence into Yemen. And there was also the general fear by Saudi Arabia and by the UK and by the US that because Ibrahim al-Hamdi was so left-leaning as he rightfully was, but without the socialist label, because he was very much opposed to any political label of any kind, but he was very much left-leaning, at least economically and politically. There was a general fear that he would be able to find common ground with the Marxists South Yemen, and which he did. I mean, they were probably at their closest to negotiate a unification deal at the time. And just 2 days prior to a major meeting that was scheduled in South Yemen, in Aden, he was murdered in a banquet by his immediate right hand man, and likely paid by or instigated by Saudi Arabia. So he was murdered. The sitting head of state in South Yemen at the time, Salim Robai Ali, was also murdered in a coup. So all at the time their progressive forces were liquidated right, left, and center, and the figureheads that rose in their stead were nothing but puppet figures that could be manipulated by Saudi Arabia and the United States and the United Kingdom. And that continues actually onwards up until the 1990s or 1990, when Yemen finally reunifies, but that was more of like an economic necessity because the South had lost the Soviet support with the fall of the Soviet Union, so they lost a good chunk of economic support and assistance. And so there was also like an economic incentive to reunify, but that also turned out horribly with the 1994 civil war that lasted like 3 months. So you have like a series of events that all contribute to Yemen's downturn at every level. And that's really where the Ansarullah finds their main roots. It's in the opposition to being pushed around like a punching bag by Empire and Saudi Arabia and all of these regional forces. And we first see the emergence of what would become, the quote unquote the Houthis and later the Ansarullah in 1993, where the movement's founder, Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi, actually gets elected on a parliamentary mandate for the first time in the first democratic elections that the unified country has in 1993. And it's funny because I mean, obviously he's a theologian. He's a religious preacher, and has his roots in Islamic preaching and teaching. But his political program at the time in 1993 was very much secular in nature. So you were talking about combating corruption, democratic reforms, economic reforms, and his parliamentary mandate at the time was backed up and supported by the Yemeni Socialist Party, because they were both in opposition to Ali Abdullah Saleh at the time, who emerged as the penultimate figurehead of unified Yemen. And he was very much opposed to the way Ali Abdullah Saleh was running the country, or came to run the country, and very much opposed to the 1994 civil war. And he suffered greatly by it. So that's before the 2000s and those events later. But that's really where the movement starts to get, right there in 1993, starts to get national clout, so to speak.
Thank you so much for that important and elaborate foregrounding of who the Ansarullah are as a group. So, and I really appreciated the connection to the material conditions, because oftentimes people, especially I would argue before the pre 9/11 world, but specifically after the 9/11 world, this kind of conjuring of the Muslim as irrational, or this conjuring
Yeah.
as a Muslim as somebody as not a thinking person, but somebody who is bloodthirsty or blood has a bloodlust for certain things. I deeply appreciate the connection to the material conditions. So then the question now is, who are the Ansarullah?
Yeah. Well, that's a very funny question because that's also a question that they themselves are trying to explain. So, just to paint a picture for you, one of the members of the movement's political bureau, Abdel Malik al-Ajri, he's also a political scholar and a researcher as well, and one of his primary research areas is to really explain what the movement is, because it's such a new trend, and it's so, in many ways, it's something we really haven't seen before in the scope and the size that really constitutes the Ansarullah. So it's not a movement in the sense that they're grounded in one particular political ideology. I mean, it's not a political party either. I mean, and it's not an organization in the sense that you have to submit a form to get a membership card. I mean, that doesn't exist. The closest explanation or categorization of the movement would be it's a current, basically. It's a political current that had its roots in what most scholars would refer to as Sayyidi revivalism. So, the revivalism of the Sayyidi branch of Shia Islam, basically. But it metamorphosizes into something much bigger than that. And we see that already in the late 2000s and the early 2010s, because it becomes also based on what Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi was teaching at the time. Becomes a movement that embraces, or at least tries to embrace, all Yemeni people, no matter their political affiliation or their Islamic religious affiliation. So it's multi-sectarian and spans pretty much every political current on the spectrum. And one of the key things that Hussein al-Houthi was arguing at the time was that the religion of Islam had become entrenched into a small clerical elite that would interpret the religion detached from the way the people interpreted the religion. So he was very much like a proponent of bringing the religion back to the people on a people level, grassroots level, eye level stage, where it would serve not just like as a rallying point for the people, but also as a fitting political philosophy and analogy that would explain current events. So he used Islam as an analogy to explain the post 9/11 world. So the emergence of US imperialism in the Middle East, or not the emergence, but the exacerbation of it, the as imperialism after 9/11, and also the events going on in Palestine, which is really at the core center of the movement. So with that in mind, he became gradually more outspoken against the regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh. And Ali Abdullah Saleh knew at the time that Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi and his project would become a tremendous threat to his grip on power. And he was already dealing with a lot of internal strife. He had Al-Qaeda in the east, and he had southern secessionists in the south, and he had daily protests almost in Sana'a, the seat of political of rule in the country. And now he had an emerging group in the north he also had to deal with. But contrary to both the secessionists in the south and Al-Qaeda in the east, Hussein al-Houthi managed to attract a level or degree of popular support that none of the other belligerent groups were able to gain, basically. And that's where we start to see, the whole Iran-backed Houthi rebels, the whole narrative of a proxy group acting at the behest of a foreign power, in this case Iran. That's where we really start to see this narrative unfold, because it's not a new thing. Ali Abdullah Saleh used that narrative to pressure the United States to give him the necessary tools and weapons to quell this brewing insurgency. And the the U.S. embassy took one look at it at the time and said, "There's literally no ground for the narrative. Like, it doesn't hold in any capacity. It's overblown, and we are not going to spend millions and billions of dollars on a narrative that is inherently false," which it actually was at the time. So he starts his own military campaign in 2004, which leads to Hussein Badruddin al-Houthis killing, very brutal killing, I believe. It varies based on eyewitness accounts, but the most probable that I've read is that he was murdered in a cave together with 11 members of his family and then burned to death, basically, as an act of revenge. Very brutal stuff. And his killing triggers what would become a total of 6 wars in the Sada region, the home region of the Ansarullah. And these 6 wars continue on in with differing degrees of intensity and last until 2010, right at the emergence of the Arab Spring in the country. And it was also, after Hussein Badruddin al-Houthis killing, that his younger brother Abdel Malik Badruddin al-Houthi, takes over the movement as, takes over the leadership of the movement and continues to this day to hold that position. So yeah, the wars come to an end around the 2010s, and that's where we see, the Arab Spring protest starts to take place, and all opposition factions and political currents in the country join these protests against Ali Abdullah Saleh because they all agreed that he absolutely had to go. But it didn't turn out quite as they would have hoped. He was not, Ali Abdullah Saleh was not forced from power by the people. He got a lucrative deal by the Gulf Cooperation Council, and they said, if you step down right now, and if you stay in the country, we are gonna make sure that you're granted immunity and will not be prosecuted for anything that you've ever done in those like 30 odd years if you've ruled the country. And his deputy, Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi, was then put on the seat of power on the presidency in his stead, and became an even more loyal lapdog than Ali Abdullah Saleh would eventually, was known as. So yeah, that's a brief
Thank you.
historical background, but nonetheless important, I
No,
guess.
absolutely important. Christian?
Yeah, you actually brought up a lot of things that I wanted to ask about, but I wanted to start with you mentioning the often characterization of Ansarullah as a proxy group for Iran. And I wanted
Yeah,
to ask if you think that is a label that undermines their agency. And further, how do we understand their role and their relationship with other major powers and major political actors within the Arab region? Many have been interested in Ansar Allah recently because of their support for the cause of Palestine. So I
yeah.
was wondering if you could kind of touch more on their relationship externally and beyond the politics within Yemen.
Yeah, sure. So the Iran-backed Houthi rebels narrative was, when Ali Abdullah Saleh initially coined that narrative, so to speak, in the early 2000s, it was with the presumed goal of stripping the movement of their national and local agency. Because, the Ansarullah is really a child or a product of decades of extreme economic downturn for the country and poverty and lack of education, all of these material conditions that has led the country into like a downwards spiral. And they're very much a product of that, and Ali Abdullah Saleh could not contend with the fact that here was a group in emergence that addressed all of these ills and problems heads on in the way that they did, because Ali Abdullah Saleh had always been a figure that would brush the problems aside in order to gain more for himself. I believe I talked to Shireen Al Hadaimi yesterday in another podcast, and she claimed that Ali Abdullah Saleh, when he was killed in 2017, he had around $60 billion in offshore, you know, personal funds. So that really speaks to the level of corruption that Yemen was dealing with at the time. He embezzled everything from the state treasury. So yeah, definitely a way deliberate attempt to strip the movement of not just their national agency, but also very much their very national background, so to speak. In terms of where they stand in regards to their regional partners, they do maintain very good and cordial relationships with the broader axis of resistance that we know it as, with Iran and with Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, and even the Palestinian armed factions in both the West Bank and especially in Gaza. But they're very much an autonomous group in many ways. I'm sure you could argue the same with practically every member of the Axis of Resistance. But in Yemen, or with the Ansarullah, it's not as much that they are joined with the Axis of Resistance or with Iran based on some shared religious belief necessarily. It's more of a relationship based on unified geostrategic objectives that speaks to resistance against colonialism and imperialism, and to rid the region of the US and UK influence and direct military influence as well. But they're very much an autonomous movement, the Ansarullah. They take their own political decisions. Their military actions are independent. So the Red Sea blockade and the targeting of cargo ships in the Red Sea is very much their own doing. No other political entity has told them to do this. Not even Iran has told them to do this. They're very much very independent and political and ideologically autonomous in that way.
Thank you so much. So, yeah, that was my next question. Thanks for bringing up the wider discussion of the axis of resistance. Because I guess the question is, what is the Ansarullah's relationship to the axis of resistance? Because we often see the leader of Hezbollah, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, will praise and speak about the actions in the Red Sea. Given that they are an
Yeah.
autonomous group, but then what is that relationship then?
Did you mean the relationship in relation to Hezbollah, or
In
the
relationship
general?
to the axis of resistance more broadly.
Okay, yeah. So if we stay with the historical background regarding the whole Iran-backed Houthi rebels narrative, it's funny though that one of the reasons that Saudi Arabia initially began bombing the country and really waging war against Yemen from March 2015 and onwards was because their objective was to rid the country of what they perceived as malignant Iranian influence. The problem was that the so-called Iranian influence was practically non-existent at the time. In 2015, Iran had no influence over the Ansarullah at all, except for cordial diplomatic relations, which they still maintain to this day. But I'll give you an example. When the Ansarullah was entering the Yemeni capital in September of 2014, the Iranians actually advised them against doing so. And, as history would have it, they did it anyways. So that really speaks to the level of autonomy that they operate from. But in general, they do today coordinate extensively with the axis of resistance. They coordinate with the Iraqi groups, with Hezbollah in particular, where they share a very very fruitful and very cordial relationship. Not as much like a military relationship, but a diplomatic one. The Ansarullah has a dedicated TV station that broadcasts from Beirut, right next to Hezbollah's own Al Manar TV station. So they've been granted a certain level of closeness with that movement in many ways that probably other groups haven't really. I mean, that's only a theory, but it would be interesting to see if that sticks. But yeah, They do share very good cordial relations also with Iran, but that's more diplomatic relations more than what has often been claimed to be military cooperation. There's been this whole idea of Iran sending the Ansarullah ballistic missiles and drones, but that's not physically possible and hasn't been physically possible for over a decade when you consider that the Saudis have maintained a land blockade, a sea blockade, and a naval blockade of the country for all this time. And ships are regularly, intercepted in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and other adjacent seas. Where Iran and the Ansarullah are cooperating militarily, it's mostly regarding the sharing technical expertise regarding certain weapon systems, and the Ansarullah likely receives blueprints that would enable them to build and manufacture their own missiles and their own weapons based on an Iranian design, and then they get technical instructions on how to do that properly. So that's at least in one instance where the movement has been developing a closer relationship with Iran over time, because they certainly right now maintain a closer relationship with the Islamic Republic than they did just back in 2015, where it was practically non-existent. And also with the added benefit that Iran has granted the Ansarullah diplomatic recognition as the rightful, legitimate government of Yemen, because they do have a government seated in the capital Sana'a and has a Yemeni ambassador from that government reside in Tehran. So yeah.
I actually wanted to follow up on the weapons or the relevance of weapons within the narrative of
Yeah.
Ansar Allah being a proxy group for Iran. And I wanted to ask, beyond blueprints, are there other sources to where they're obtaining these arms? I've seen many mention that the U.S. and other imperial forces supply weapons to propped up governments, and many of the weapons that Ansar Allah has are recouped from U.S. support of propped up governments. So I wanted to know, do you think the conversation around weapons with regards to Iran backing Ansar Allah is another form of decreasing their legitimacy to build a military and political force within their own nation?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, when the war first started in 2015, it's very important also to keep in mind that around a little over two-thirds of the conventional Yemeni armed forces went over to their side, switched over to the Ansarullah. We're talking, you know, before the war started, the Yemeni armed forces maintained around 88 brigade-sized units, and more than around 50 or 60 of those brigades actually went over to the Ansarullah, and the rest went with the exiled president. But the Ansarullah very much were granted they got many of the brigades that had the bigger weapons. So one also has to keep in mind that when Yemen reunified in 1990, they absorbed the military arms stockpiles of South Yemen, which was predominantly Soviet, North Korean weapon systems, ballistic missiles and artillery and tanks and small arms and all of that stuff. And that was absorbed into what become the unified Yemeni armed forces. And when the war started, many of the brigades that had access to these weapons switched over to the Ansarullah. So we're talking the missile brigades, the aerial defense brigades that had the anti-air missile batteries, the Republican Guards, which had the newest weapon systems, so like the newest in Russian tanks and small arms and the best trained infantry, and even the Air Force joined the Ansarullah. There was a very short skirmish around March the 21st, 2015, where the Yemeni Air Force was actually bombing the residency of the exiled president Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi in Aden in South Yemen. And they were very clearly pro Ansarullah at the time. But the Air Force was also the first targets that the Saudi Air Force bombed when they first began their bombing campaign a few days later. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that the additional Iranian support, technical expertise, and blueprint support necessarily diminishes the national agency of the Ansarullah, because there's no strings attached to that support. Like it's not the same level of support that the US gives to their loyal satellite states in the region, where there's always strings attached, whether they be economic or strategic or political strings. Like if we, like the US says to any country, if we have to give you these weapons, you have to take a loan from the IMF that you'll never be able to pay off in the next foreseeable future. I mean, that relationship doesn't exist between Iran and the Ansarullah. So there's no strings attached to it. It's not that Iran says to the Ansarullah, hey, if you receive these weapons, you have to take orders from us. I mean, that's not a relationship that exists. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it diminishes or negates their national agency. I mean, to be fair, the movement and the country has been isolated for the better part of a decade. So at least in my view, it's positive that one major regional power is able to assist them in their struggle for what for independence and political autonomy. So
Thank you so much. So, I want to talk about some of the things that people say to detract from the Ansarullah. Specifically, people will say things like, but they're not Yemen's official government, or they're not Yemen's official army, for example. Or they even
yeah,
go as far as saying that, oh, they were involved in a sectarian war of killing so many Sunnis, for example. So, I kind of want to, yeah, maybe one by one, we can kind of talk through these statements that are used to detract that Ansarullah and their positionality within Yemen.
yeah. So the narrative that they're not the legitimate government is, at least in my view, kind of absurd, because political legitimacy is not rooted in what the so-called rules-based order tells us it is. Like the legitimacy of any political government is not rooted in what the United States think it is. I mean, inherently political legitimacy is rooted in the people and the people alone, and it's the people that decides what government is legitimate representative of them in their view. So with that in mind, what we, or what the United States has been calling the recognized government, I mean, two things. First of all, they're exiled in Saudi Arabia, so they're not even in Yemen at the moment. And secondly, they have zero, not just zero authority or executive control in Yemen, but they have no political legitimacy in the eyes of the people. I mean, people in general in Yemen despise that government and wouldn't want to see them return in any capacity. Which leads me to the second narrative, that the Ansarullah doesn't maintain a a real army, because they certainly do. I mean, as I mentioned previously, 2/3 or a little over 2/3 of what was the conventional Yemeni armed forces switched over to the Ansarullah already back in 2015, and even some say late 2014. And they've been developing these brigades and reorganizing them ever since, to better be able to combat the aggression against the country and the Saudi regime and the United States and so on. And they do maintain a very strong, conventionally organized military force with infantry brigades, mechanized infantry, an air force, which they've been able to reactivate after all these years, and a navy, and aerial defense and coastal defense as well. They have a very good military infrastructure that is able to safeguard Yemeni, or Yemen's political sovereignty and political independence. And contrary to that, their belligerent forces, or the forces opposing them, do not have that same military capacity as the Ansarullah currently does. Even the so-called, recognized government, they made their own, or established their own army called the Yemeni National Army. And it's not even an army, it's more of like a militia. They are poorly trained, poorly equipped, and relies mostly on light infantry for the most part. They don't even have the same artillery support or aerial support or armored support that the Ansarullah army does. They are more so, could be more classified as a militia. And it is funny because it's always been the Ansarullah that has been given this classification of being like an illegitimate militia. But if we really look down into the specifics, they are in most part the Yemeni army. I mean, that's just a matter of fact, so to speak. So yeah, and to the third narrative concerning the sectarian or presumed sectarian nature of the war. I'm not going to sit here and deny that there may have been sectarian strife in the country. I mean, that was certainly brewing around 2013, 2014, 15, and in the years that passed later. But I would not consider the war as a whole to be sectarian in nature, because you have, to give you an example, within the Ansarullah, or the government that is seated in Sana'a, the capital, you have the Supreme Political Council, which acts as the executive branch of government, instead of a president holding the executive power. So you have a council with 10 members from different political parties, believe it or not. And then you have the parliament, which is also multi sectarian and multi different ideologies across the political spectrum within the parliament. And then you have various individuals that are assigned as people to assist the government and the executive branch with like laws and legislation and so on. And many of these people, one of them, I can't really remember his name on the top of my head, but he's the one of these people that have been appointed, in this advisory capacity to the executive, is actually the head of a political Salafist party in Yemen. I believe they're called the El Rashad party, and they're like a moderate Salafi inclined political party that emerged right around 2011, 2012 in that time frame. So they do have that support from that segment of society. And then you have the General People's Congress, which is another party that is also largely dominated by Yemeni nationalists. I mean, it was Ali Abdullah Saleh's old party, and he used to, spearhead that party. But they also very much loyal to the Ansarullah, and it's taking part in this government. And also, I mean, the Sunnis are the de facto majority, demographically speaking, in the country, around 60%, or give or take around that ballpark. So it wouldn't be possible for the Ansarullah to administrate and control territory where 80% of the entire population of the country lives without at least the tacit support by the people, across different Islamic sects and political observations. So as I said, to begin with, I wouldn't rule out that there has been sectarian strife, but to say that the whole war, I mean, the war as a whole is rooted in sectarianism, I believe that to be very much a false premise.
Thank you so much. Going back to the role that Ansarullah are playing right now geopolitically, and some of what we call the Western left and leftist, which is a term that I hate. Something I've come to see and come to recognize is that because of perhaps the refusal or dismissal to engage with anything that has a veneer of religiosity, that there is an inability to grasp what is happening. So, for example, why is it that every time that spokesman for Ansarullah gives a speech, he will begin with verse of the Quran, for example? Or why is it that this solidarity is to do with Al-Aqsa and the meaning of Al-Aqsa and the Palestinians, brothers and sisters? And I also feel there's also dismissal because failing to kind of grasp with the role religion and Islam plays in an anti-imperial struggle, when you put it into, like, I don't know, the leftist brain, it doesn't add up. It doesn't compute. So I kind of want to know if you had any thoughts on that, or what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, we have to be fair and say that Yemen is an Islamic country. Western scholars might categorize it as religiously conservative, but in any case, religion plays a very, very big role in the country, and it always has. I mean, this is not this is, it transcends political currents and political beliefs. Even when the two, or when Yemen was divided between two states, Islam was by law considered the state religion of South Yemen, which was nominally speaking a Marxist-Leninist state. But at the very least, Islam was the state religion. It was mandated by the state, and it was allowed to flourish because the socialist leaders in South Yemen also knew that they couldn't, in their right mind, limit the influence of the Islamic religion and still hold on to power. I mean, Yemen is the Yemeni people are very proud of their Islamic upbringing, and for many reasons. But one of the primary reasons is that the Yemeni people are the only people, or one of the only people, if my memory serves me correctly, to have been blessed by name by the Islamic prophet Muhammad in the Islamic hadith by name, and that's something that's very cherished by the Yemeni people, to have been given that extraordinary privilege all those years back, and it's something they cherish to this day. So I still believe, I've been of the belief of for many years, that the Western left in particular, or the transatlantic left, if we have to be very specific, has failed to really account for that reality, that Islam plays such a major role in Yemen, not just on a spiritual level, but also on a political level and organizational level, and right down, to the people level. Islam plays a role. And that's not something to negate or brush away or to diminish in any way, because that's just how Yemeni society has been for hundreds of years, centuries, ever since they were. I believe they were actually the first Arabian people, as a society, as a nation, to convert to the Islamic religion 1500 years ago or so. So that's one thing people have to contend with. And it's also in the religion that they find their moral codex, their moral obligations to, side with the oppressed, not just in the Islamic or Arab world, but actually in the entire world, at least, because they've been very outspokenly supportive of Venezuela, very outspokenly supportive of President Maduro, against U.S. sanctions and U.S. attempts to manufacture a coup d'état against, Maduro's government. They've been very outspokenly supportive of Venezuela in that regard. And as I said, the Islamic religion, even the Yemeni Socialist Party, believes in Islam as like a moral codex. Like the Socialist Party is not secular in that aspect. They may be more secular than other political factions, but they're still very religiously committed, or committed, to the religion of Islam. So if one takes that into account and, starts to contend with that fact that Islam plays such a huge role in Yemeni society, then I guess more people would be able to effectively show their solidarity with the Yemeni people if they understand, where they're coming from, basically.
Thank you so much. And I have. Oh, sorry, Christian. Do you want to go?
Oh yeah, no, there was a question I wanted to ask before, we moved on to something else. But I guess I think earlier in the conversation, you had alluded to that Ansarullah has no necessarily, concrete central political ideology. But I wanted to get
Yeah.
a better idea of what their general aspirations are. And one thing that I think more broadly that interests me is the fact that they've been able to be so impactful and successful in a variety of ways, despite despite not necessarily being the state itself. And I wanted to get your thought on their relationship to the state of Yemen, and in general, is statehood necessary to have to have greater military and political impact?
Yeah. So The Ansarullah, first of all, as I also mentioned, doesn't subscribe to any set political ideology, and that's actually very deliberate because in their view, they believe that if they have to gain as much popular grassroots support as possible, they cannot limit themselves to any set political codex of any kind or any set political ideology, whether left or right or even centrist. The only political aspirations that they are very broad in the sense that they are aspirations that most people can rally behind. So we are talking political reforms, economic reforms. Economic self-sufficiency plays a huge role in their political philosophy. Agricultural self-sufficiency is also a huge factor in that as well, because Yemen used to be agriculturally self-sufficient for hundreds of years prior to the events that transpired in the 1960s and 70s and onwards, where Yemen gradually became more and more dependent on foreign aid than what they were able to cultivate on their own soil, basically. So that whole tradition of agriculture kind of faded away over time. And they've been trying very hard to revive that old, rooted in culturally rooted, cooperatively driven agriculture, which is, has always played a huge part in Yemeni society. But in general, they do not subscribe to any set political ideology, and it's very deliberate because, as one Yemeni analyst said many years ago, Anas al-Qadi, he's a member of the Yemeni Socialist Party, he said that the currents that have moved Yemen forward all these years is what in the country is known as the Yemeni National Movement. And the Yemeni National Movement is a broad movement that, transcends ideology and political observations and method of conduct, but it includes nationalist currents like Ibrahim al-Hamdi. It includes socialist currents like Salim Rubai Ali, South Yemen, the Yemeni Socialist Party, the National Liberation Front, and the National Democratic Front, which existed in North Yemen at the time. And he argues that it now also includes the Ansarullah because many of the goals that the Ansarullah have been wanting to implement is directly in line with what previous members of this national movement have been trying to do. So first of all, regain political independence, limit or eradicate Saudi influence, which has always been considered malignant by practically everyone except for those on Saudi payroll, of course. And rid the country of corruption, more democratic freedoms like freedom of speech and elections and education, health care, all of these basic necessities that Yemen has practically always lacked for better or, for the better part of 6 decades, actually. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, in regards to the whole question of state legitimacy and statehood, the fact is they are not. It's difficult to really describe in detail because, as I said, even members of the Ansarullah are still figuring out how to, describe their own movement. But in regards to statehood, they have what is known as the political bureau of the Ansarullah, which is in broadly speaking the politically executive branch of this inherently grassroots movement, and they are members of parliament. They are members of local government, local governing councils in the regions, and they are dominating and sitting at the in the Supreme Political Council, the executive branch, where the chairman of the Supreme Political Council is also the chairman of the Ansarullah Political Bureau. So in that sense, you could argue that they dominate the state apparatus by having, the political head of their movement sitting at the helm of executive power. But the whole idea that they hold administrative power over 80% of the Yemeni population as a sole entity is a flawed analysis because there are many different political parties and political figures that are also taking part in this, what is essentially a governing council that transcends political currents. So yeah.
Thank you so much. And I have One or two more questions actually. Why is the term Houthi seen as derogatory? And the second would be just a final one of anything you feel like we've missed out that we should include.
Okay, so the term Houthi is a derogatory label because it limits the scope of the movement to solely tribal grounds. All right, the Ansarullah is very much a national movement that does not limit itself to one particular region or the other, but very much tries to attract the entire population across, from east to west, north to south, and all regions in between. So to call them Houthi would be derogatory, first of all, because it imposes a tribalist label on a nationalist movement, which is false. And secondly, Houthi is a subsection of one of the major tribal confederations in the country, specifically situated around the town of Houth, where the last name Houthi comes from. And I recall listening to one of the speeches that the leader of the movement, Abdel Malik Badruddin al-Houthi, was holding, was televised, and he said that the Ansarullah is not just a movement for the people living in the city of Hoth. Like that's not even 100 people. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But of course, for those who oppose the goals of the Ansarullah, it's beneficial for them to continue imposing this label of a tribal, extremist, tribalist group that is trying to control the entire nation when the opposite, it's actually, it happens to be the case that they are not a tribal group, but very much a nationalist group in that sense. And yeah, I guess that's pretty much it.
Thank you.
I would say just closing off that just to underscore what I've always held as my own personal belief, that Yemen is one of those countries where if you look at the individual events that have transpired over time, especially from the 1940s and onwards until today, you would find a common thread through all of them, that ties everything together basically. So to argue as some have done, which I cringe almost at hearing it because I hear it all the time that the Houthis are some kind of anomaly that transpired out of thin air it's patently false, because if you follow these events and figure out from where and what the relations to why these events transpired in the first place, you would find that it's all interconnected. And that's just one thing I would like to really underscore for potentially other people with an interest in digging into Yemeni history and politics, because it is very interesting, but everything is interconnected, and one would quite quickly realize that when analyzing the history.
That was a masterclass. I deeply appreciate this conversation. Thank you so, so much. I'm going to leave Rune's social media, which is a wealth of knowledge on this topic, and hopefully you can engage with his work further. Peace out and take care.